Havens. Richie Havens. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report, as we return to Brian Willson, Vietnam veteran, nonviolent peace protester. On September 1st, 1987, Brian lost both his legs when he was run over by a U.S. government munitions train. He was taking part in a nonviolent action to attempt to stop the train from bringing those weapons to Central America. I continued my interview by asking him how the FBI and the Concord Naval Weapons Station in California responded to the incident that day.
Well, the base at the time said they didn't see us, which was inconceivable because the locomotive that hauls those munitions always has two spotters on the very front of the train in radio contact with the engineer, making sure the tracks are clear, and the speed limit is 5 miles an hour. And they could see us for 650 feet. So the fact that they said they couldn't see us was simply their admission that they were not doing their job or they were lying. Some reports said I was pushed onto the tracks by one of my comrades that were with us at the time. They said there were 40 of us there. There was 3 of us on the tracks, and there were 12 Vietnam vets there that day, so they were all there in solidarity with trying to interfere with munitions that were killing hundreds of campesinos every day, every week, or maiming them every week in El Salvador and Nicaragua.
Had you talked with people who had been hurt in El Salvador and Nicaragua?
I talked with hundreds of people.
Before
and after. Before, I had spent many months in Nicaragua in the war zones, and I had been to El Salvador talking to guerrillas and talking to human rights workers, understanding the incredible extent of murders that were going on and maimings and displacements because of fear of being murdered. So I had spent lots of time very viscerally moved by what I was finding. One day in the spring of '87, before I went to the tracks, I visited 200 amputees in the hospital. And I remember coming out of the hospital and sitting on a stone outside the hospital. This is up in the war zones in Nicaragua. They said, their legs are worth just as much as mine, not knowing that I was going to lose my legs. 3 months later.
Brian Willson, you sued. Who did you sue, and what did you learn in the depositions and the information that came out?
I sued the train crew, 3-member train crew, and all their superiors, 3 levels above them in the chain of command, and I sued the Navy. The train crew sued me first, actually, in a bizarre suit that was in court for 2 years before it was thrown out. They sued me for causing them mental duress. Very bizarre, because I didn't get out of the way. I sued them and the government under the Federal Tort Claims Act, which is suing the government for negligent acts of its employees. And in the depositions, we learned again how the train crew, the 3 members, had been ordered that day not to stop the train when they came on duty at 6 in the morning. The Navy report by that time had concluded that they could see us for 650 feet and never braked, even after they finally admitted they did see us. They never even attempted to brake. In fact, they opened the throttle to accelerate. And I had to sit in the deposition room for 40 hours, 5 8-hour days, with the train crew sitting right across the table from me with their 7 lawyers, and I with my 1 lawyer on the other side. Part of the deposition, they requested me to turn over both of my passports and went through every trip I had made, and not just Latin America, but the Middle East, asking me who was hosting me, who paid for my trip, who drove me from the airport, where did I stay. And it was a pretty intense process, of course, that they were trying to establish some. I think they at one point tried to establish that I was an agent of a foreign government, which would have been, if I hadn't registered, I would be violating the Foreign Agents Registration Act.
Which government were you supposedly?
Nicaragua. At one point, somebody said, oh, Muammar Gaddafi had given President Ortega money to go on a PR campaign in the United States, and that I must have been one of the recipients of that money. And of course, it's just, these people can't comprehend that people might act on conscience without being paid. It's outside their frame of reference to even grasp it, including my own parents, of course. My parents, after Vietnam, after my pretty radical shift from an epiphany in Vietnam, I was never able to talk to my parents.
Talk about that moment. Talk about why you decided to go to Vietnam.
Well, I was drafted.
What year?
1966, and I was in graduate school.
What were you studying?
I was studying law and criminology.
Where?
In American University in Washington, D.C. It was a combined law school master's program, and I didn't think I could be drafted because I was a student, but I fell through a loophole.
Which was?
I came from an agriculture county, Chautauqua County in western New York, and it was a farm county, grape farming and dairy farming, and young men who worked in the family farm had an absolute deferment, and schools were preferential deferments. And in those agriculture counties, when they were running out of eligible young men who didn't have a deferment, they dipped into the school deferment pool. So there I was. I was for the war. I was very right-wing. I was very anti-communist. And I enlisted in the Air Force for 4 years as an officer rather than go in the Army or the Marine Corps. And after 2 years at Headquarters Air Force as a lieutenant, I was sent to Vietnam as a ranger, trained 12 weeks in ranger training. And while I was in Vietnam, I was asked to assess the after effects of bombings of, after effects of bombings of targets, not thinking initially that a target was a village. So in 1 week in April of 1969, I witnessed the after effects of bombings of 5 inhabited fishing villages in the Mekong Delta with somewhere between 700 and 900 dead Vietnamese, more than half of whom were children, all napalmed, and I just broke down. It was inconceivable that I was witnessing this. And from that point on, I realized that the Vietnamese were my family and I was on the wrong side. That's quite a startling conclusion to come to after 27 years of heavy conditioning in the American, ideological system. But it was very clear to me that these people and I were the same. And of course I became very anti-war while I was there, which simply meant I was speaking out against the war to my superiors. I wasn't going to stop the war, I wasn't going to stop the bombing, but I was expressing myself primarily to keep my sanity. Pardon me? Did
other people agree with you?
No. At the time, nobody did. My superiors laughed at me. I said the rules of engagement require us not to prohibit us from targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure. And they laughed. And of course I realized there is no such thing as a real law of war. It's rhetorical, it's written down, but once you're in the war zone, there is virtually no rules or laws. And that was it was illuminating to me. I probably had to go through that experience to really get it, to really get that my conditioning had really dehumanized me. And I now needed to embark on a process that I call being a recovering white male, which is a lifetime process of learning about my empathy and my deep interest in mutual respect and cooperation, and not to shoot people and to harm people, even if I don't agree with them. It's called nonviolence.
What year did you come back from Vietnam, Brian Willson?
I came back in 1969, early, because I was sent home early for my anti-war views, and I still had a year left to do in the military, so I did it in Louisiana. A very changed person. I was an activist in Louisiana. I just was marking off the days on the calendar until the day I would get out, and there was some talk of court-martialing me because they had brought charges against me in Vietnam the day I left, but they never convened a court-martial. I think they would have...
For opposing the war?
There were 50-some counts against me. sedition, disaffection, conduct on becoming an officer, fraternization, theft of government property, which was another bizarre thing, just trumped up.
Rank, your rank.
I was a captain.
So you come back to this country. It's 1970. You lay down on the tracks in 1987.
Well, I sat on the tracks. I didn't really lie down. I was sitting in a lotus position like this.
So talk about that 17-year journey before the track.
Well, I finished law school in 1972 and already had a master's degree. I discovered I couldn't comply with the protocol of the court, so I knew I wasn't going to be a courtroom lawyer. I just couldn't automatically respect any authority figure ever again. I really couldn't do it. I didn't trust myself to obey an order ever or an instruction. It had to be earned. And so I left law and did a lot of work on prison issues, addressing the injustices of the what we call the criminal justice system, which I call the criminal injustice system. I was working as a lawyer for various organizations, but I wasn't a courtroom lawyer. I did that for many years, and including as an aide of a state senator, Jack Bachman, in Massachusetts, where I had my flashback to Vietnam, actually, which was quite intense in 1981. I worked with veterans for several years.
What did the flashback mean? What did you see? What did you experience?
I was in a cell block in Walpole State Prison interviewing prisoners, and while I was on that cell block, unexplainably, two guards dragged a prisoner out of a cell in the same block, on the same floor. I was on the same tier, and they were stomping on him with their boots and hitting with their club. The prisoner was screaming, and in a prison, you know, with the concrete and the steel and the iron, it's very loud, echoing noises. At that point, I was in Vietnam, and I had to get out of the prison. I was actually interviewing a prisoner at the other end of the block. I actually started staggering down the walkway of the tier because I was walking over bodies. I was bracing myself against the cell doors just to keep my balance. And in my mind, I was actually in a village, one of the villages I had examined after the bombings. I was crying. I don't know what the guards thought, but I had to go through 7 doors operated by the guards to get to my car in the parking lot, and I just sat there for an hour and a half shaking like this and sobbing uncontrollably. Couldn't drive. And that's when I became a Vietnam veteran, even though I wasn't particularly interested in being reminded of it. I was kind of ashamed, actually, that I had not known better. On the other hand, it's where I got my epiphany, which changed the whole direction of my life with a certain amount of very empathic feelings about the world. And interestingly enough, the first rap group I went to get help, I said, I can't conceive of a way to heal myself from this traumatic experience without dealing with the immorality of the war as a policy that I got caught up into. And nobody in the group agreed, and the facilitator of the group said, we don't discuss politics in the rap group. And I said, politics? I said, this is part of my experience. I don't know how I can possibly work my way through this without understanding the absolute carnage that we were participating in. We killed 2,100 Southeast Asians on average every day for 11 years. I mean, how do you explain that without having to go to the soul of a nation? I had to go to my soul. Well, then I did direct an outreach center for 2 years and filed claims for PTSD and Agent Orange for other veterans. And I resigned from that position and took my first trip to Nicaragua to study what Reagan was calling the Soviet beachhead and the Marxist-Leninists, which I knew, of course, was a code word for poor people organizing for their own self-determination. And within 1 week after being in the mountains of Nicaragua, my very first trip, I couldn't speak Spanish. I had to have somebody always translating for me. The Contras, Reagan's Contra-terrorists, the people he trained and armed to overthrow the Sandinista revolution, attacked 3 farming cooperatives, killed 11 people. I saw 6 of them coming in on open caskets on horse-drawn wagons to the cemetery in Esteli, and I just wept. And I knew then that that's how all civilization has developed, on exploitation and incredible cruelty and murder and maiming. And then I really studied the history of civilizations, and so I really became quite a history student, realizing I knew nothing really about history. I did not know contexts. I didn't know how other people really felt when they're being repressed. And I mean, I did know, I have a sense of it, but I really wanted to know how extensive this had been for several thousand years. And I wanted to understand the context I grew up in this, you know, during my lifetime. And so that experience in Nicaragua led me to take many more trips to Nicaragua, studying the U.S. policy and meeting many Nicaraguan. I lost 50 Nicaraguan friends that I had met and acquaintances to the Contras that were killed. And in El Salvador, there were 15 that I had gotten to know who were killed by the death squads. And so it becomes very personal. It's like your family's being murdered. And when your family's murdered, some kind of a response.
And so ultimately you sat down on those tracks.
I sat on the tracks, and you can't move those trains without, those weapons without moving my body. That's right. Because those people in Central America is my family. They're part of my family. And the other 2 veterans felt the same way, of course. And lots of people feel that way. I mean, you know, it was all new to me, discovering this awesome nature of humanity and empathy, and how little I had been allowed to express those feelings because I grew up in a society that promoted individualism and competition and acquisition, acquiring things, rather than cooperation and community and inquisitiveness, curiosity. I became very inquisitive. I wasn't trained to be inquisitive in any serious way in graduate school or in college.
Vietnam veteran Brian Willson. His memoir is called Blood on the Tracks, The Life and Times of S. Brian Willson. We'll come back to this conversation in a minute.